Hi, this is Dan, and today I want to talk about market research, and in particular, why The Acolyte is one of the prime examples of what happens when you ignore market research. First of all, let's talk about why market research is important. Yes, on the one hand, you can say that it is anti-creative, because what it does is it probably tells you, oh, this is an idea that might not be the greatest thing because it doesn't have XYZ component. That's actually market research being abused. What the market research at the conceptual stage should be is that once you feel you've found a script that was great and that you have faith in it, the market research should be kind of an indicator of how much you should spend on it. Like, for example, if you wanted to do, for some reason, a remake of A Trip to Bountiful, it would probably be a good idea for you not to spend more than somewhere between $5 and $10 million. You would not want to spend over 100. And yet, that is what a lot of the problem that's been happening recently is that it seems like rather than looking at market research at all, what companies are doing is that they are shopping market research. In other words, if someone tells them something they don't want to hear, they will go and accuse that company of being incorrect in their data collection or somehow wrong. And the most infamous example of that, you might recall, is that when streaming first decided that it was going to try to get regular ratings, the same way broadcast TV and even premium cable would buy ratings just to see what they were actually doing, even though in the case of premium cable, you could tell just by viewer numbers. Anyway, what ended up happening is that all of the streaming services said that Nielsen did their data wrong. Why? Because Nielsen was telling them that no one was watching their shows in the numbers that they needed it to. So they decided to suppress that research. And one of the reasons why the Nielsen research was so at odds with what the streaming services were figuring out on their own or trying to track on their own or trying to bury on their own is the fact that the Nielsen's usually count 8 contiguous minutes of viewership as being needed before you can click and say that someone has watched it. Well, one of the ways that the streaming services got around it with their own internals is that they were doing total minutes. Now, total minutes is a ridiculous way of doing it because someone could watch something for a minute and say, this sucks, and move away. And that's probably where a lot of it was based on the data that would come in once that the Nielsen's were allowed to come in and give their takes. Because you'll notice that the Nielsen numbers are often very skewed from where, which come in a month later after all the damage has been done. The Nielsen ratings are very skewed relative to what the streaming services themselves are reporting. And let's be honest, self-reporting is really not the best way to do any kind of research. You have someone who has a vested interest in making the news as good as possible. Now, where does this fit in with The Acolyte? Well, obviously, Disney didn't throw The Acolyte out there sight unseen. Obviously, they were looking at a lot of data that was coming in and telling them what would work for The Acolyte, what would be the best way to get this in front of people and not create a problem. And so they probably did a lot of surveys. They probably did a lot of test screenings. And I'm going to bet, without ever having seen any data, but just having done this for a number of years, that their data was coming back that people did not like the show. Therefore, there was no way to advertise it on positive word of mouth. And a lot of times, the way you can advertise on positive word of mouth is, especially in the days of TikTok and everything else, is have people who generally saw it and liked it comment on those social media services as to the why. Because nobody ever likes a movie or TV show in quite the way that the studios would like you to. Many times, some of the biggest hits have been hits in spite of the way the studio positioned it, because for one reason or another, it connected with the audience. Now, that was in the days when you would have longer playouts so a movie could be discovered by fans, as what's happening with Furiosa right now. But they've already blown Furiosa's chance to have legs because A, it opened too big, and B, They've already announced when it's going to start streaming. They did the same thing with The Fall Guy. If you're not going to have any faith in your project, why spend that kind of money on it, right? So this is a real issue that has come up, that there's a lack of trust in the areas you should be trusting the most, which is if someone is telling you something is not fantastic, don't throw good money after the bad. And that's another problem that has been coming up in the industry to a great extent nowadays. Now, let me go back in time a little bit to the days before streaming and discuss what some of the basics of market research are. Well, some of the basics of market research is that the way you determine between a hit, something that will probably not lose money, and something that's going to be a problem is you look at what the overall ratings are. And there's really two ratings that matter the most, and that is the excellent rating, and that is the definite recommend rating. Very good is just what it says, very good, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's all that much enthusiasm behind it. So therefore, that becomes something where somebody will say to you, wait until it streams. An excellent and a definite recommend generally lead to somebody being enthusiastic about the movie or TV show and saying, you've got to watch this. In fact, I'll come and see it with you. So in other words, you're generating an enormous amount of audience interest. And if when you're doing your previews, you are finding out that there is much more enthusiasm than you thought. In other words, your excellence are higher than you anticipated by a lot, you might change the size of your release. You might change some of the down market secondary markets. Well, of course, now everything's based on streaming. We've gone back to what's in effect a one market system, which was not smart, but it is what it is. But still, knowing that it hit theatrically means that when it's in streaming, it will go through several streaming cycles, 18 months, premiere cycle, Netflix, NBC Universal, whatever. And then they'll switch around, and it'll be able to be at least something you can advertise every step of the way. And it could have a very long play out as it goes through 18-month cycle after 18-month cycle. Usually you'll get 2 or 3 of those at best before it becomes something that's just part of the what's available out there and goes to linear media and ends up being in that zone. So an excellent rating, the norm, that means the average, what you want for a movie that will probably make your money back, is somewhere between 25 and 30%. I'm going to say 30% because that's more on the safe side. So if you get more than 30% rating your movie excellent, it'll probably be combined with a high very good, by the way. It's very seldom that you'll have a high excellent unless it's really astronomical and not an equally high very good. The very good should also be approximately 30, which means that your top 2 box, the excellent plus very good, should be about 60%. And that'll mean you'll probably get your money back. Now, why do I say the excellent is more important than the very good? What if you have a movie that instead of getting a 30% for the excellent, gets a 10, but the very goods are 50? Well, first of all, you know that there's probably a reason that's holding them back from rating it excellent. If you find out what that reason is, maybe you can fix it. And at this point, when you already have huge numbers, the desire to transition from very good to excellent becomes key. It becomes critical. And you're going to try to fix that. Now, the combined excellent, very good, you'll notice is 60. The definite recommend, the norm is 45. So ideally, you should be over 45. So this gives you a good picture. We don't even go with probable recommends or whatever. Just look at the definite recommend. If you have very high excellence and an above norm definite recommend, then you're almost definitely going to have a hit. There are certain times when a movie will come out and it just is at the tail end of a genre, or it's coming out at the wrong time, or something disastrous happens in the real world, and all of a sudden there's a reason why your movie doesn't hit. But most of the time, if you hit those numbers, you will have a success. Now, why is this important in streaming shows or television? Because with television, you are in a different mindset than you are with theatrical. With television, you are inviting people into your home to enjoy a show, and it's almost like inviting friends in. So with television, once you have a hit, then your job is sustaining that hit. Or if you happen to have a bad season, doing something about it. When I was working on Baywatch, our season 8 was an absolute disaster. The company was in the process of being bought by another company. So all of the attention was not on Baywatch. The attention was on the merger and what was going to come out of it. So season 8 of Baywatch was particularly bad. It was already season 8, so it was already past its sell date, meaning that it was now strategically important for the company to keep it around, but you were actually getting too many episodes. Thank God the show was already in profits from its first airing. Otherwise, it wouldn't have lasted this long. So they did an extensive market research that included cross-country, in-depth group sessions with people who said they at least occasionally watched. Well, I got to tell you something. Those people who occasionally watched the show knew the show better than those of us who'd been working on it. And I'm serious as a heart attack about that. They knew stuff, they already remembered stuff about the series that those of us who'd been working on it for 8 years go, yeah, now I remember that, but it wasn't top of mind. And yet it was something important to that audience. So what ended up happening is they retooled the show, brought in Mitzi Capture, focused it a lot more on David Hasselhoff. It was clear that Pam Anderson wasn't as important as everyone felt that she probably was. She was important, but when given the choice between should we keep David Hasselhoff or either reduce his appearances and increase Anderson's, or should we go with total Pam Anderson? And it was enormously pushing toward, if it's a choice between David Hasselhoff and Pam Anderson, it's David Hasselhoff. If it's a choice between reducing David Hasselhoff and boosting Pam Anderson, it's David Hasselhoff. So that, I have to tell you, was a bit of a surprise. But considering that we already knew that the primary audience for Baywatch was not who anyone anticipated when we first started doing the show, because you still thought it was male. No, it was always females 35 plus. So that part about Hasselhoff makes sense, which was good news because David Hasselhoff was the reason for the success in Europe and then soon to be Japan. So it was so that was a confirmation. The show improved enough to where in season 9, it improved by a third. Old shows generally do not go up by a third in their ratings, no matter what you do to them. But Diagnosis Murder and Baywatch were two shows that were very elderly, were having problems, did a research, turned it around. And that's how you make it work. Now, how many times have we heard that a show jumps the shark? And then there's often a lot of machinations to bring it back from having jumped the shark. And that often doesn't work. This is where streaming has a problem. When you only have 8 to 10 episodes every season, if it's not a limited story that ends during those episodes, you don't have enough time to really have people bond with the characters enough to where you can tell the good from the bad. And if you think about it, your average 22 episode sitcom series or 1 hour drama has a terrible ratio of great episodes to average episodes to poor episodes. You can usually, in 22 episodes, have 5 bad episodes a season. And it doesn't hurt the show because you have at least 5 great shows. And the rest are somewhere in between. And that's good enough because it's like gambling. If you win a big jackpot, you're going to keep putting quarters in the machine, right? So So you can have that kind of a split. You have 8 to 10 episodes and one or two of them is bad, you don't have that goodwill equity built up. You don't have all of the average shows that were still enough to carry people through. And a bad episode is enough to kill a show, especially if its budget is too high. Now, why do I say that The Acolyte is a prime example of this? Because it is clear that the reason the advertising for it is exclusively about how the only people who don't like it are the terrible original fan base. Can I tell you that even though that worked for a very short period in terms of the BuzzFeeds of the world and the Twitters of the world, it never really worked that well with the general public, who found themselves getting more and more alienated from the actual programming. And for a while, because all of the streaming services and everyone else was caught up in the irrational exuberance that the money was going to keep flowing and there wasn't going to be a consequence for wasting money on bad stuff or not being careful with budgets. That all went away. And then you had the strike. Now you're in a problem because you're going to have to, by definition, not be spending 22 million, which is what The Acolyte cost per episode. You have to make it work with less money. Now, surely if you look at Baby Reindeer, which, I really, really liked. It's an emotional story. I know it wasn't cheap, but it also wasn't that expensive. It had a lot of below the line bling. It had a lot of nice stuff in it, but I can't imagine that it was anywhere near $15 million an episode, much less 22. So you have a show that actually works, that actually has legs, that if Netflix would get over themselves and actually physical media it, they would have an additional stream of income coming in from that. I understand why they haven't, because Netflix is still caught up and stuck, at least temporarily, in the idea that physical media is dead. Well, the fact that Sony's going around collecting all of the physical media from the major studios to do the distribution for it should key people in that just because physical media might be down in the US, in the rest of the world it isn't. So Sony is saying, okay, Hollywood's going to be stupid. Notice we didn't jump into streaming, right? Yeah, we jumped in a little bit into the sequelitis and let's make everyone a girl boss, but we got over that more or less. So you have Sony saying, okay, this is something we can capitalize on it. This is additional money. It still brings in a nice amount of change. Now, let's go over how The Acolyte could have benefited from doing even the least bit of market research. First of all, I think that if they had gone out and done even the basics of pre-production type concept development, they would have come back with the notion, you better not do this. This is not something that you should do. You are already dealing with a franchise that is in a lot of trouble. You're dealing in a franchise that's losing a lot of money. Do not throw good money after bad. In the second phase, once the scripts started coming out and people were looking at what the actual content of the show would be, there should have been nobody who said an acceptable budget is $22 million an episode. So at that point, they could have, if they were insistent on going forward with this, keeping it low budget. Now, based on some of the things that have happened around it and some of the documents that have come up since, it's clear that this was never an intention to be anything other than a movie that was used or a series that was used for something else. I'm not going to speculate on what that is, although I have a suspicion, but this is not the right venue for that. Thirdly, once they started getting rough assemblies of the episodes, then they should have market tested it and seen what was working and what wasn't. Because if you haven't shot the back half of the series yet. And with 8 episodes, you actually have time to do this. They could have said, okay, we are jumping the shark big time with this. We have a high likelihood that there will be viewers who do not make it all 8 episodes. What is something that we can do that can be de minimis for the first 2 to 4 episodes, although it's still challenging because clearly there was a lot wrong with it. But what are some of the things that we could do to ameliorate that? Is there some kind of additional walk and talk scenes that we could shoot on the cheap that could cover some of the more egregious challenges that were going to be coming up? Should we do something that is extreme and maybe abandon at this point and cut our losses? Because it's better to lose 44 million than to lose 180 million, certainly, right? So that should have been discussed at that point. Thirdly, because of the way that the show appears like it's going down the rabbit hole, I would have probably said, again, cut our losses. Let's not do reshoots at that point. If we're not going to do cheap walk and talks and we're not going to go in there and try to fix it, then the thing to do is just get it out there and just wrap it. Don't spend any more money than you absolutely have to. Now, I haven't heard about this going through the kind of reshoots that things like She-Hulk went through. So that is potentially a good thing. Who knows? This thing might have cost $300 million if they did a ton of reshoots. Number 4, I would have started the marketing even earlier than they did. And instead of going after audience outrage, what I would have gone after instead is absolutely sold this as an alternative universe, especially if some of the rumors of what's coming up with the show turn out to be true. And the reason I would have done that is because then perhaps we could look at a second season of the show in this alternative universe, or do a Bobby Ewing steps out of the shower, that infamous moment in the TV show Dallas, where they completely threw away a previous season by having it all turn out to be a dream. Yes, it's an extreme action, but when you are talking about burning down a valuable IP, sometimes you have to do something extreme, even if it's cockamamie. An audience will forgive you. Look at what has happened with Game of Thrones. The last season of Game of Thrones, I actually have some understanding for because it was similar to the last season of Baywatch. That's season 8 of Baywatch, where there was a lot wrong with it. And then we went ahead and fixed it, and then the show went up. So House of the Dragons has pretty much, I believe, gotten audiences to forgive the way Game of Thrones' final season was fakakta, because they came in soon enough. They did an honest repair job. And now people are anxious to watch that. Maybe not to the degree that they were hysterical for Game of Thrones, but we're also talking about multiple years later. So the fact it still has that much juice is fine. So they can, in fact, fix it at this stage. Let's look at another show that didn't fix it, Sopranos. Now, the last season of Sopranos, especially the last episode, was mired in controversy. Of course, now you have people looking back 20 years later saying what could have been fixed. But you note that the prequel to The Sopranos did not work. And why didn't it work? Because they never fixed the problem that people who had watched the first series for years were upset at the way it ended, because it wasn't clear what happened. And I know that part of that was to keep an open window for Gandolfino to come in and do more episodes. Then he died, but it was open-ended enough to whether he got blown away or whether it was just, okay, well, this is the end of this particular story and we can pick up later, or do a prequel. I think they were actually thinking they could do that. But the pushback to that last episode was so strong, they said, we better wait a while. And that waiting a while led to them never doing anything to fix it. So once Gandolfini was dead, that was it. And The Sopranos is what it is. It's a great show. But as people are rewatching it, Did well in physical media, by the way. Not as well as it should have, but that's because it ended badly. But it had enough to where it still resonates with people today, despite the ending. And people, because they've had 20 years to get over their anger at it, they now accept it as it is what it is. And it's maintained its position as a classic, not unlike All in the Family, where people don't even remember that Archie Bunker's place existed. There's times when we can be nice with our memories. And in the case of Star Wars, all they need is a great movie or a great series to fix it. This was not it. And instead, now they have made it even more difficult with whatever they're planning to do next. Didn't have to be this way, but that's showbiz.
It stinks 1. Fair 8. Good 24. Very good 47. Say, we've never had cards like this before.
Give us more like this one.
Excellent 34. Outstanding 17.
Oh, boy, wait till I fly these around the executive dining room. That'll show 'em.